Hi, everybody, and thank you for joining us in this great webinar, which is the 9th webinar of WAPPP, World Association of PPP Units and Professionals. We are glad that we have you all today, and we want to talk about contract conditions for resilient PPPs. We want to know how to negotiate and implement these kinds of projects with success. Next, please. This webinar is organized by WAPPP, which is a Geneva-based global independent non-governmental organization. It aimed to establish an international network of PPP units and PPP practitioners involved in the design and implementation of PPP. Key benefits of WAPPP include global collaboration, mentorship, networking, and the promotion of best practice, advocacy for PPPs and the profession, and to help societies achieve the UN SDGs. As I mentioned, next please, today we want to talk about a very important topic, which is about the resiliency of these kinds of contracts. We have three great speakers, Jean-Christophe Barth, Marc, Frilet, and Primah Atugonza, and my name is Hossein Nourzad. I will moderate this webinar today for you. I am an assistant professor of infrastructure management at the University of Tehran, and I work as an accredited trainer for CP3P program, which is a PPP training organized by the World Bank, working with training by science, and I will moderate this session today. Next, please. Today, we want to talk about PPP and the contract conditions. For that, I will start very briefly to talk about what is PPP, in fact, what we are speaking about. And then in part one, Primah will talk about these types of conditions from the public sector perspective. In the next part, Marc will talk about the private sector considerations in these kinds of contracts. And then in the third part, JC will talk about a very important, and I would say like a new approach to these kinds of like projects, which we call it tripartite perspective, which will basically seek for a win-win-win approach for these kinds of projects. After this presentation, we will have an open discussion that you can ask your questions, and to the time that we have, our speakers will answer the question. And if we have any questions remain, we will prepare the answers basically posted on the WAPPP website. Next, please. But now,
maybe for the open discussion, it would be helpful if there are questions to please use the Q&A box, not the chat. Use the Q&A, please.
Yes, in the middle of the presentation, please, if you have any questions in each part, you can just type your question in the chat box, and then we can basically manage the time to answer your questions. As I said, if we could not have enough time, we will post the answers online later this month. But okay, so we are talking about PPP, and as it is defined by the World Bank. PPP is a long-term contract between a public party and a private party for the management and or development of a public asset or service in which significant risk transfer is happening to the private sector. And these kinds of projects are always output oriented. We look for output specification, which means that we try to basically link the remuneration of these kinds of projects to the performance of the private sector, to make sure that everybody basically has its interest aligned. And that means that PPP, in fact, is about people. And to make sure that we design a win-win-win approach, we need to make sure that we have a resilient and a sustainable approach, which basically will guarantee the success of these kinds of projects. And that's what we want to focus today. Next. And if you look into the spectrum of these kinds of contracts, we have to the left, we have contracts that has less public less private risk and control to the right, in which we have full private risk and control. So to the left, we have traditional contracts like design and build, or build only construction, or even design, build, finance. In all these kinds of contracts, the risk transfer to the private sector is not long-term and is not significant, which means that the interests of both parties are not aligned. And to the right side of this spectrum, we have privatization, which is the permanent transfer of the asset to the private sector. And there is no contract, there is no continuing role for the public sector. In fact, we do not call it a PPP, but then in the middle, we have different types of PPP. Either government pays PPP or user pays PPP, or on the other hand, we have infrastructure PPPs or service PPPs. And in all these types of contracts, we need to make sure that the contract is resilient enough and is flexible enough to align the interests of both parties. Of course, the interest of the public sector is to satisfy the need of people. In fact, it should be. And the interest of the private sector is profit. So in PPP, we need to make sure that these interests are aligned through the whole life cycle of the asset, which is a long term. And that's why we should look at basically at the problem from different perspectives. And that's what we want to exactly do it about. Next, please. So in the first part, we will look at these types of projects from the public sector perspective by Primah. Next, please. Primah Atugonza is our first speaker. She is a legal counsel with the projects team at the African Legal Support Facility. As a legal counsel in the project team, Primah is directly involved in advising African governments in complex commercial contracts and ALSF operational sector, including public-private partnerships. Primah's roles involve assessing requests received from African governments and conducting due diligence to assess the readiness of a project for legal support from the ALSF. Primah also works with both international and local counsel to deliver approved projects. So Primah, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Hossein, for that very kind introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure being part of this conversation today. And I really want to thank the World Association of PPP units and professionals for organizing this webinar. So before I jump into the key considerations for the public sector, let me sneak in a little bit about what the ALSF does in order to provide a bit of context in the conversation we shall have today. So the ALSF is an international organization that's hosted by the African Development Bank in Abidjan, Cote d'Ivoire. And our mandate really involves providing transactional and capacity building support to African governments in our key operational sectors, of which PPPs is one. To date, about 50% of our operations are in infrastructure and PPPs in both Francophone and Anglophone Africa. So our conversation today regarding the public sector is going to come from both our observations and our recommendations advising governments. So let's jump to the topic today. Next slide, please. So traditionally, one of the key considerations for governments in choosing to take the route of PPP has been value for money. And what is value for money? It really is at the most basic level, assessing whether PPPs are likely to offer better value for the public than traditional procurement would. However, following the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the UN is now advocating for a new model that has been dubbed People First PPPs. And under People First PPPs, value for people takes the center stage, as opposed to considering value for money in isolation. So what is value for people? Value for people is when the net benefits of the projects, the benefits that are directly linked to the projects, be it economic, social, environment, and other such broader benefits, whether they are enough to compensate the actual financial burden that will be borne by the taxpayer in the third and the fourth generation. And whether you look at government pays PPPs or user pays PPPs, as Hossein discussed, the burden is always borne by the taxpayer. And so value for people is really assessing whether the benefit from the project is equivalent to the value that, the wholesome value that the taxpayer is receiving. So what are the key considerations when we're looking at value for people PPPs? So value for people is especially critical at this point because of the long-term nature of PPPs. PPPs are a very special type of contract because they will run for 20 to 30 years. In 20 or 30 years, project terms are definitely going to need to be updated. Project circumstances are going to change. Fingers crossed, governments will change. And so considering value for people at the beginning of the project is extremely important. Another key point is the trickle-down effect of the project cycle. And so this means that value for people has to be incorporated in the entire project cycle. So poor project preparation and not conducting sufficient feasibility studies, for example, will trickle down into the requirements for procurement, and that will trickle down into a poorly drafted project agreement, and finally, very poor project implementation. So value for people has to be considered at the beginning of the project, and we're going to have a little bit of another discussion at that. And of course, the undeniable effect of infrastructure PPPs on the environment and infrastructure projects on the environment definitely means that this is the right time to have the conversation about value for people, as opposed to only considering value for money. Next slide, please. So the case for people first PPPs has to be made in relation to the entire project cycle. And I'm going to share a little bit about what we at the ALSF are doing to ensure this. So if value for people is going to be incorporated, we have to start from first steps. And the first thing to consider is the legislative and the institutional environment. This means that PPP laws, procurement laws, PPP policies, and as well as the institutions that implement this have to adapt to this approach. As the ALSF, we assist African governments. We have and we continue to assist African governments in review of their legislative environment. And currently about 33 African countries either have a PPP law in place or a PPP policy or some sort of PPP legislation in place. And it's a very good time to discuss value for people because many countries are either updating their laws or specializing these laws. And this means that at this point, value for people can be incorporated. And another important point is the model that governments choose. So it's important for governments to choose a wholesome model. And many practitioners will propose the design, build, operate, and finance model. This is because it will allow for the private party to play around and get wiggle room to incorporate value for people alongside the entire project, through all the project phases, including construction and operation. So if value for people, money will be made up along the way, considering that since it is the same player, and value for people will be considered along the way since it is the same player. So this is the model that is really, that's really proposed for governments. So let's jump into the project cycle, which is the diagram to the right, to my right. And we'll start with project preparation, which is the most important stage of the cycle. And it's simply because at this point, you can incorporate things like climate change risks into feasibility studies, because this will give the government an idea of the potential project impact. When you move to project procurement, which is the next stage, then value for people can be incorporated through simply requiring the private parties to adhere to international standards, which will usually put people at the forefront of these projects. Now, another really important aspect is the project agreement, and well-negotiated project agreement will allow for flexibility without necessarily changing the pricing of the project. So there is currently no standardized PPP agreement, but the World Bank has provided guidance notes on a PPP agreement. The UNECE has also provided guiding principles that are specifically adapted to people first PPPs. So government can borrow inspiration from all these places. So at the ALSF, we especially support African governments by creating toolkits. And usually for PPP units and for PPP projects, we will create a toolkit that includes a template PPP agreement that can be adapted to different projects. And lastly, when it comes to project implementation, we cannot belabor the importance of flexibility because the project term is so long. And so the agreement that we've just discussed has to be designed in such a way that flexibility is permitted. Next slide, please. So let's discuss what we have found to be key considerations for governments when negotiating with the private sector. So the first and most important thing is a fair and progressive risk matrix. So the risk matrix is the heart of the PPP agreement, and governments are consistently looking for fair ways in which to share risk, because honestly the reason for choosing to go the PPP route is to be able to share some of this risk with the private sector. And we're going to consider in the next slide creative ways in which risk can be shared and in which governments can have conversations with the private sector. Another important bit is flexibility, which we just discussed. The private sector has to sit at the table with the knowledge that the agreement has to be designed in such a way that it is flexible without necessarily changing the price or without necessarily requiring renegotiation. Also, governments are increasingly looking for private parties that will walk the entire journey with them, starting especially with project preparation. So our experience at the ALSF is that private parties want to jump in at the point that projects are already prepared, but it's really a chicken and egg scenario, because if there are no projects, then the private parties will not be able to jump in. And so governments are increasingly more interested in a developer that will come in and do the dirty work of project preparation and then carry on the project until handover of the asset. Another important thing that governments look at is termination rights. So governments are increasingly looking for fair termination rights and obligations because they are aware that early termination comes with termination payment obligations. But again, the long-term nature of PPP agreements dictates that early termination may indeed be inevitable. Take the example of COVID-19, where many PPP projects are hanging in the balance. And so the question remains, what happens where governments want to terminate agreements for no other reason but a change in strategy because of the pandemic? So increasingly, governments look for good faith that's shown by the private sector through provision of, say, sufficient grace periods prior to termination, through provision of a continuity regime such that termination is the last option. And those are the sort of discussions that we see governments more interested in. Lastly, the elephant in the room, PPPs remain undeveloped and underdeveloped on the continent because of the massive costs that are associated with project finance. So the costs related to advisors, to the various advisors, are even magnified on the African continent because of the lack of capacity. So governments have to entirely rely on external advisors that are extremely expensive. And so governments are interested in conversations right now where we're considering impact investing, for example, where profit isn't the only consideration, but impact of the project is also a consideration. Now, lastly, let's have a look at a few clauses and a few interesting ways. Next slide. Next slide, please. And a few interesting ways in which risk can be shared. First off, let's look at clauses where risk is entirely borne by the government. And I'll start with the change in law clause. So traditionally, the risk associated with change in law has been entirely borne by the government. But right now, conversations are being had on how to hedge this risk. It might not necessarily be shared, but it can be hedged. And creative ways are, for example, setting a minimum cost threshold below which a private party will not be paid. So this means if there's a change in law and the impact is so small financially, then the private party will not be paid. And so that means that the risk associated and borne by the government is reduced and or is hedged. So the same thing goes for the material adverse government action, which is a clause that's usually introduced in less developed PPP markets and is really political force majeure. And which this has also been borne entirely by governments, but they are now looking for creative ways in which this can be hedged. And this can be hedged, for example, by introducing different relief regimes for fault and non-fault political force majeure. So where there is, for example, a non-fault political force majeure event, such as a war in a neighboring country, that has a trickle-on effect on a private sector, on a project, then the government is looking for that to be treated differently from a war that's within the country that has been caused by the government. So just creating different regimes will also show good faith on the part of the private party. With force majeure has definitely been discussed extensively over the last 8 to 9 months. But when it comes to people first PPPs, the things to consider are things like introducing climate change risk into force majeure. This will allow to put people first, and it can allow for termination of the contract without very huge financial obligations on the government. And this is what puts people at the forefront, as opposed to just value for money. Transfer of land really is a no-brainer. Governments are not willing for the private sector to transfer land, although they will give them exclusive use of the land as well as allow them to mortgage. And I know that we do not have time to discuss the entire PPP agreement, but in general, concessionaires will be required to adhere to international standards, which they're usually willing to, but more importantly, they will be required to require this of their subcontractors. So really, in conclusion, governments are looking for private partners that will allow for them to play their role as the protector of the people. And when it comes to PPPs, this means that there should be flexibility, there should be shared risk, and there should be reasonable costs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Primah, for providing such great considerations and insights about the public sector perspective on PPPs. We learned that in addition to value for money, we also need to make sure that we consider value for people as well. And we consider that the risk structure in the project is basically optimized. And it's not just basically looking at the project at the very start, but also because it's like a long-term project, we need to make sure that we take into consideration all termination stuff as well. So in the next part, we want to look at the conditions from the private sector perspective. And our next presenter is Marc Frilet, which is the managing partner of Frilet firm. For over 35 years, Marc has focused on complex construction, infrastructure, concessions, PPP, and mining projects in France and in over 20 developing nations, most of them in Africa. Marc has more than 100 publications and is a frequent speaker at conferences, seminars, and capacity building programs around the world. He is the Secretary General of the UNECE International Center of Excellence in PPP Policies, Laws, and Institution, and Vice President of the French Institute of International Legal Experts. He has contributed to develop the concept of People First PPP, and we have this honor to have him today to look at these kinds of projects from the private sector perspective. Marc, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Hossein. In my experience, if you are a good private sector company, really interested to participate to public-private partnership on the long term and to deliver public service to the end users, you are very concerned to develop a fair and resilient and sustainable PPP project. Private sector know very well that if it is not the case, if there is an issue, if there are disputes, termination, then there are little chance to win eventually against a government. So it's essential for the private sector to look at the matter in a most objective manner, to understand what to do, and to see how to resolve the issues. There are situations in the PPP where resilience is more important than in others. The situation is when you are dealing with PPP projects which are of concession PPP type. Why? Because in concession PPP, the private sector has not only to finance, to design, to build, and to operate a project, but he will be compensated from users' fees. He is not compensated just when at the end of the facility, when the output is there. He will be compensated if for 20 or 30 years, the public is happy and is ready to pay for the service it is provided. So that's why resilience is much more embedded in concession PPP than in PPP, which are subject to public payment PPP at the end of a production line or for power, for water, etc. Now, this has triggered, of course, a lot of exchanges along the years. And nowadays, we have reference documents on how to arrive to resilient and sustainable concession PPP through the UNECE activity on the matter, which has produced a list of recommended clauses in concession contract, in people first, public-private partnership, in support of United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. This has been approved by the UN member states, and it is a recommendation. Now, in order to understand better how to approach the situation, that is a document. I think it's important to start by the issues which are more or less specific to concession PPP. Next slide, please. So, actually, what is more specific to concession than to any other kind of contract or investment contract which can exist around the world? First of all, one, the infrastructure which will be built, developed, will only be dedicated to the providing a public service, nothing else. It cannot be resold for any other activity, and that is something which is very different for any other kind of private investment. Then the recovery of the investment will only take place after decades, which relates to a project life cycle. And the recovery is subject to the payment by the end users of the price for the water from the highway, from the port use, etc. So then very much dependent of how the society is appraising the benefit of a particular service delivered or not. Then another thing which is very specific is that the full infrastructure in good operating condition has to be transferred for free to the public authority at the end of the project life cycle. So that is extremely specific to those kind of projects. Now, when it comes to operation, it's also very specific. You have all the public interest issues. It's not a one-to-one contract between two private parties. You are, as a private sector, you must understand that you have to deal with public interest, and you, public sector company, need to find out how to best meet public interest. Now, you have two lines of public interest to consider. The public interest for the beneficiaries of the concession of the infrastructure. Public interest means for those people who will pay for the service, they want to have an equality for the service, They often want to have the continuity of the service. You cannot just disrupt the water service. You cannot stop a highway or railway. You cannot close a port. So continuity of the service is absolutely essential for the beneficiary. Then what they want also, that the service must be always adapted to the needs and financial capacity of the users. If I'm proposed a service for a railway, for a highway, for the water, which is beyond what I can really afford as a consumer, then of course there will be a problem. And the private sector company must understand and does understand that it is a key issue to consider, to have a service always adapted to the need and capacity of the users. Then, the private sector knows that also he has to understand what the government expects. The government expects over 10, 30 to 30 years to have the possibility to make changes, to adapt, to terminate, to develop a new service, to change if there is, for instance, a competing road to make next to highway, etc. So then the private sector understands that it has to take into account the fact that the public sector will have sovereign rights on the contract. So these are very specific issues, and the question is how that permits to consider developing a contract where the private sector will be happy and the public sector at the same time comfortable, looking always at the end users. All that, of course, is made for the benefit of end users by both parties. So next slide. So the basis for a true partnership relationship becomes then quite clear in the mind of the private sector. We will only enter into this partnership if we together we have a clear and overriding statement of objective. It must be clear that both parties, not only one and the other, are control. That is not the real life for 30 years. Both parties intend to deliver the best public service all the time. That is absolutely fundamental, and this statement must be the overriding statement for having also, to a large extent, the possibility to be subject to judicial review if this is not complied with. And then you have many underlying cases which would go in that direction. Both parties knows very well, and Primah said that already, that there will be unknown factors. There will be unknown factor over 30 years' time, which may affect the project, affect the cost, affect the nature of the service, change in the technology, and many issues, of course, such as climate changes, such as COVID and other. We know in advance, both parties, that we don't know. That thing will happen. So then what is essential is to find out a situation where, in those situations, it will not entail renegotiation. It will not entail dispute. Then all the challenge is to agree on a resilience project, which means that we have to include in a contract as many clauses which permit to reach that resilience level in a situation where the three parties of the project, i.e. essentially the public authority, the private sector, and the end users, will be happy. So then how to go in that directions? We have to consider both construction phase and then operation phase. Construction phase. The construction phase, the public sector should benefit of the best skills of the private sector to design an infrastructure which will meet the functional specification in terms of outcome, in terms of output, in terms of quality, quantity of water, in terms of how many cars will go through the gates and under which circumstances, etc. So those specifications are designed by the private sector, of course, after fair competition, finding out which company has the best chance to design the optimum specification. And when this is done, then the private sector is free to develop the infrastructure, knowing that if the infrastructure is not able to meet the performance criteria for 10, 20, or 30 years, then the problem will go back to the construction phase, because we are speaking of a global contract. We are not speaking of a contract where we have, on the one hand, construction performance indicator up to a certain time, then finished, and after an operation company would come and we can make claims. No, we are speaking, in that the essence of concession, we are speaking of a contract which is a real global contract. In the meantime, of course, the public authority has to check if the facility of the infrastructure is well built and has the best chance to meet the indicators with all tests which are necessary. So there is a step where at some point of time, when the facility or the infrastructure is able to meet the parameters for a sufficient period of time, then at that time, there will be the acceptance of the facility or an infrastructure by the public sector in accordance with norms, environmentals, and many other norms, of course, which exist around the world. In this situation, the private company is happy to provide a guarantee for performance and liability for default, because in any case, if that is not well structured at this stage, if there is a problem in 5, 10, 20 years time, it will fire back to the private company. So that is very important to keep in mind. Then you have the operation phase. The operation phase, you have immediately the issue to clarify what is the relationship between the operation phase, where you have to produce, to provide the service for many years, and the situation of the construction of the infrastructure. That will be very clearly explained as a global obligation, which means often that you have to have an interface contract which clarify all the points and put the right liability to the right person at the right time. So that is critical in order to have a good project. Then you have to define clearly the scope of the public service. What means public service? What are the limits? The limit in terms of course, boundaries, the limit in terms of scope, the limit for which kind of people in the area, and this leads to particular service delivery obligation. Then what becomes the most important maybe in the operation phase is to be extremely clear on the condition for change of scope and tariff. This is actually becoming the most important part often of a good and sustainable project. What are those conditions? Are we in a rigid contract where any change means additional cost? Are we in a very flexible contract where we don't know how to negotiate? No, we need to find a balance between the two. Rigid contract, for sure, never work in those kind of situation. Loose contract with a regulator from outside, also in the experience of many of those projects, doesn't work very well. So the idea to find within the contract a system which permits to always adapt and to be resilient becomes something on which we have to focus. Next slide, please. On what are we, on what thing we have to focus upon? We have to focus upon, and Primah said that already, on the risk matrix as heart of the PPP agreement. What does it mean in real world? We need to have an agreement, and that is a main agreement of those kind of projects, on an economic and financial and fiscal scenario, or financial scenario, which is comfortable for both parties. No extreme on a particular point, but comfortable. And this has to be translated how? This is translated in provisional accounts and contractual project business case. All the difficulty is to arrive to provisional account, and contractual project business case, which is really strong, well-structured, robust, with conservative expectation. The more we are in that situation, the more we have chances to have a fair and resilient contract. So in the process of designing and agreeing the eco and financial scenario becomes a major process. And this process nowadays is quite well developed in several reports. For instance, in a source report on how to develop, how to design a well-prepared project, and in several other reports which have been also produced with the UNECE role. The process is to start by a concept, to be sure, first of all, to have the best chances that the project has to be developed under a concession PPP against other type of private participation in public infrastructure. So then that's the first thing. Concession PPP is a good solution. Why? Because it doesn't impact or very little on the budget, because it permits to have the best skill of the private party entirely used both for construction, for operation, and capacity to adapt the service. And it's very different from pure design and build. It's very different from design and build operate. It is something by itself. Now, in this process, then you have to go further. Once you have done that consideration, further what you do is that you develop several steps on pre-feasibility, feasibility, then financial feasibility, etc., altogether arriving to an economic and financial scenario, simple, robust, and which can be summarized in a very, very simple matrix, at most 3 pages. That is the core of a good project. Everyone will understand the project. Then another thing which is essential in this is to find whether this scenario, which by definition is designed to permit to the private sector to develop the project, to build, to operate, to make changes, and to have a reasonable profit. Then next thing is to find out whether the economic and financial viability has a chance to stay or not. And then from there, you develop financial and economic viability indicators, which include internal rate of return and tariff setting. So then you have a scenario, it is agreed, and you have financial viability indicator, which tell you whether or not in a few years' time, you are still within the original agreement of the parties or outside of the original agreement. Principle is economic equilibrium. The exchanges which have been done many, many years on this in concession PPP is that the economic equilibrium is one of the key issues to agree upon, to clarify. We have different economic equilibrium. You have the operating equilibrium, and you have the project lifecycle equilibrium. I don't have the time to enter into the detail, but you have to discuss this and to agree. Okay, if a private party is behaving well, if not in default, then the entitlement for economic equilibrium as a matter of principle is justified. What does it mean? What are the consequences? We'll see that. Then, in order to have a chance to have a project which continue to be developed in accordance with the original willingness of the party, with a basic agreement, you need to have a regular update of the business case, and you review the economic and financial viability. That is a real partnership. That means that everything needs to be transparent. And I can now arrive to next slide, which are then how to deal with changing condition. Well, when you have the economic and financial scenario developed in a way I mentioned, when you have the indicators on economic and financial viability, then changing conditions are not really a difficult issue to address, meaning that you are arriving at a stage where resilience and sustainability become natural, because embedded in the system. Example, change in laws. I mean, many discussions over the years on changes law in different places. What is the situation? The situation is to find out when a change of law takes place, what is the impact on the change in law, the real impact on the change in law on the financial and economic scenario. If the scenario is well designed, if all that is transparent, you will find very easily and very quickly the impact, negative or positive, of the changes law on the contract conditions, on the contract implementation. So then you have immediately a possibility to quantify the issue of change law. To start with, you don't know anymore. Then you do the same, changes in tax and custom regime. If you have a good economic and financial scenario and financial liability indicators, easy to find out the consequence on changing tax and custom regime at any time during the project life cycle, because you have your matrix that you adapt, that you update all the time. Then you have another one, which is leading to many controversial issues around the world, enforcing changes of economic circumstances. Hardship, what is that? The situation where the economic, general economic situation have a negative impact over a certain threshold on the contract conditions. It's not the fault of the private party. It's not the fault of a public sector, and the contract can be carried out. It's not force majeure at all. The contract can be carried. What do you do with that? Again, you can quantify it, and then once you have quantified, you will see what to do with that. Force majeure is much simpler. Force majeure is something which go to the root of the contract, which prevents something to be done. For me, for instance, in my view, in our view, in those contracts, COVID is not force majeure. COVID doesn't prevent a long-term contract for 30 years, for most of the case, to be carried out, even if for 1 or 2 years you have a problem. COVID is much more hardship. Then what you have, again, but still force majeure, it's not difficult to quantify, and you should never say that you have to stop the contract because of force majeure after a few months. For a contract which lasts for 30 years, that would be a disaster for everyone. Then you have changes, for public interest reason. Those changes are something that a state always is sovereign, and the state, when it deals with PPP, is giving a mandate first to a minister to develop a service here, and the minister give a sub-mandate to the private sector to deliver the service. So then all that is a pure question of mandate. So then I have finished with the change of technology and the consequence. I just want to insist on the consequences of changes and the joint liability indicators. Within a certain threshold, the consequence of all those changes have absolutely no impact on the contract. The show must go on within the threshold. Beyond the threshold, then it will have an impact on the contract. Impact means what? I finished. You want me to finish? To conclude?
I just want you to speed up, please, to have just time for question and answer as well.
Okay, let me just finish on this. I will not put my next slide. It's not an issue for me, problem for me. What I wanted to clarify is that when you have changing conditions, then above certain threshold, yes, there is a right. Is that a right for indemnity? In most cases, no. It is a right for compensation, which is very different. It's not a discussion between lenders, between financial people. It's a discussion between the two partners. And you may adapt the project in many matters, such as having 2 years more for the contract, changing a little bit the scope of the service. So sorry for having long, but I just wanted to highlight a few core issues which are really, for the private sector, essential for develop public-private partnership.
Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you for your great insights. It is interesting for me that even if we want to take to have like a look at from the private sector perspective, we still need to take into account like public concerns and people concerns as well, to make sure that in fact, basically we need to learn how to look at the problem from the perspective of the other party And that's how we can basically create a great partnership. And because the reason that I just ask you to speed up, because we are receiving very interesting questions. I want to make sure that we at least have enough time to answer some of them. So by that, I would like to go to our third part of the webinar. Next, please. And in the next part, we want to talk about a tripartite perspective, in which we have an integral look at the problem. And this part is presented by Jean-Christophe Barth, who is the Executive Director of the World Association of PPP Units and Professional. He is an experienced international mediator and recognized board governance specialist. After bank apprenticeship, he graduated in law and later earned an executive MBA. He started his career in corporate banking and compliance, and later worked on long-term infrastructure projects in the rolling stock industry, where he managed complex high-value contracts and claims. In 2014, he launched his advisory boutique as a solution, which focuses on deal mediations for projects, supplier disputes, and PPPs. He is the co-author of a guide on early stage governance as an effective lever for the development of a startup. He has command of 6 languages, is married, and has 2 children and a dog. So please, JC, go ahead, and the stage is yours.
Thank you very much. So I would like to talk to you about the framing of a people-first public-private partnership. In a nutshell, it's a tripartite agreement between the people, civil society as beneficiaries, why we're doing this PPP infrastructure, the public sector, obviously, that is tendering out such a project, and the private sector that will finance, build, and operate such an infrastructure. It's important that these 3 dimensions and perspectives come along with each other well. And for that, it's absolutely crucial that the general interest is aligned with the country's vision, with the positive externalities, and all this needs to be reflected in the contract accordingly. What we want today is speak about those public-private partnerships that are SDG driven and resilient. Why is that? Because those are the ones that we need for civil society and the beneficiaries that are the reason we're doing all these infrastructure projects. So it's important that this is reflected because much depends also on the future of that infrastructure as a benefit for the people, but also what is happening with the taxpayer money. Is it going to be a government-paid public-private partnership, or will it be a user-paid public-private partnership, which we also call then the concession type of model? So just to give an overview. Now, when we're designing an inclusive and resilient contract, it's important to take an integrative view when you reflect that in the contract. When you want to make sure that all the social and environmental aspects are taken into the equation and reflected in the contract. It's really important to make sure that it translates into something that is measurable, that you need to put reference points also over the long life cycle of such an infrastructure project. And to this effect, it's useful to refer to the 17 Sustainable Development Goals that have been developed by the United Nations 2030 Development Agenda. Now, there's actually help on the way. UN has developed with the Economic Commission for Europe a tool that helps to measure the impact of PPPs, the people first PPPs to be exact. And for this to happen, it's useful to have a look at this new framework that has been developed and to then implement it into the contract. What will happen is that you will have reference points where you can measure You can work with bonuses and malice to incite to a certain behavior by all the stakeholders in such a large infrastructure program. And this will future-proof the contract as it's made resilient against unexpected changes that may occur in the long-term life cycle of such a project. It's very important to also take an approach where you want to avoid conflict. I call this non-escalation methods. And there's a couple that I would like to quickly present to you. One is called partnering. This is about developing a special relationship of making sure there's joint responsibility, a culture of collaboration, transparency, addressing difficult issues in a fair and transparent fashion, not trying to shy away or stick the hand in the sand like it's happening a lot of times, because this is essential. The people delivering the project rely on the project partners doing it properly and professionally. Now, we know that many things can evolve in a public-private partnership, but it's, you know, every project is a prototype, if you wish. There will always be unknown factors and uncertainty that may give rise to disputes. But if the parties can agree that they want to have very high quality communication at all time, and that, for example, before they escalate a dispute, they want to have it addressed there, then this is a first step of avoiding this thing to blow up too quickly. Then it's very important also that there is proper documentation of what has been agreed on. And one very useful technique to do that is to visualize these things. It helps everybody involved in such a project to know who's doing what. It helps also to clarify things. And I mean, as a lawyer, I can say that a lot of times there's a tendency to over-regulate and overly define such a complex contract. And if it's written by lawyers for lawyers, I think it's not good to deliver because it becomes too complicated and we lose a part of the people who really need to understand what has been agreed on. And so this is why it's so essential to avoid misunderstanding that can come about obligations that may arise through erroneous contract interpretations, and to just make sure that it's properly visualized and drafted, because this is not a given again. We need to constantly work on this, have mechanisms built and processes that facilitate doing this. This can be done with really easy things like an infographic. Really complex contracts can be reduced and visualized even on one page. It's important to really show the homologation process, what are the different life cycles, you know, project preparation, when is handover planned, is there a preliminary handover, what happens, for example, if there is a dispute that cannot be solved at the partnering stage and this thing goes further, who are the people who then need to be involved. So what I mean is it's important to visualize all these processes and to also, you know, make sure that all the obligations are clarified. There's a good practice of doing a contract obligation matrix, which means that you want to have cross-functional workshops by the people involved in this. Maybe also think about, in the partnering approach, shared risk and opportunity workshops, because when there are unexpected things like the pandemic, this affects both partners and the beneficiaries behind. And so from a tripartite responsibility, it's very important to reflect that in the way you work together. Then it's also good practice on long-term complex infrastructure projects to have a standing dispute board. And you should even have a dispute board when there's an absence of a dispute, because it's useful for the concession of the public service to have a standing independent dispute boards. It has a duty to monitor the project and to give responsive, non-binding recommendations. During the commissioning phase, usually you have 3 people staying on that dispute board, and later during the commissioning, 1 person may be enough. And you want to help them also multi-competence. So you want to have a lawyer in that, you may want to have a quantity surveyor, you may want to have an engineer, in order to facilitate that independent view that will help both parties that deliver for the beneficiaries to come up with solutions that work towards resolving the issues and the common goals. If you're interested in learning more about dispute boards and the dispute avoidance techniques, we'll have a special webinar on the 15th of April, and you'll be informed in due time on this. But just so you know, we'll do a deep dive on dispute avoidance in another webinar. Then specifically for these type of projects where you're involving different stakeholders from the public and from the private sector, it's useful to think about having facilitators, like doing a co-mediation. A mediation is a self-determined process that is where you have an interest-based negotiation. So maybe for those who are not familiar with mediation, there's position-based distributive negotiation, which will always, bring forward the respective party's position. But an interest-based negotiation actually looks behind the wall. What are the interests behind the positions? And for that to happen, it's very useful to have a neutral called the mediator. And in this particular case, I would recommend even having 2 mediators, a co-mediation, 1 party representing the private sector, 1 party representing the public sector, and they are the guardians of the process and will help the parties to overcome any hurdles that may come from the complexity or huge values at stake, or time limits to keep in order for the project to move forward and not be stuck in the past. Another technique also to avoid a further escalation to a court, for example, is going to arbitration, but this is almost already a final settlement of the dispute by an arbitral tribunal. It's a standard procedure to go for arbitration. It's not very cost efficient because it's a private tribunal. So you have to have witness testimonies, you have to have the arbitral tribunal. Usually it's an institutional arbitration that will be chosen, or ad hoc if the parties prefer so. There's a lot of flexibility that comes with arbitration. That's a big advantage, and the confidentiality, obviously. But the confidentiality you can also have in a co-mediation or in a dispute board. So this is just to show you quickly what type of non-escalation methods there are. And what is really essential is for the program to be regularly adapted and to promote a culture where people work together towards solutions and not engage in a blame game. I think I'll end it for here so we have time for discussion.
Okay, thank you, JC. It was great to talk about these kinds of, I would say, facilitations of this kind of partnership. We have 25 minutes for question and answer, and we received very basically good questions. So I would like to start very quickly with the questions. I will try to start like one by one to make sure that I answer the question. We answered the question, but I may omit some questions because we have received several, different questions from one person. So we want to make sure that we are answering the questions of all attendees. So my first question is to Primah, and if you guys be very basically brief and informative in your question, we will make sure that we answer all these. It's more than 15 questions that we have. So Primah, what kind of guarantees are available in African governments regarding investment? This is a question by Mr. Kekovati.
Thank you very much, Hossein, and I think the guarantees that are available on the African continents are the guarantees that are globally available. And so I think I know the spirit behind the question, and it's probably the fact that sovereigns are not willing, at least many African governments are not willing to provide guarantees. So there'll be performance guarantees. We've done projects where there are performance guarantees that are granted. We've done projects where there are the usual sovereign guarantees that are granted, and by whatever name it's called, where the government gives an obligation to make a payment based off of something, it will be a guarantee. But most importantly, I would like to discuss why guarantees are limited on the continent. And it's simply because PPP projects cannot be considered in isolation. So because a government has top on its agenda the development of PPP projects, it has to consider its sovereign debt exposure as well, which is also one of the areas that is one of our key areas at the ALSF. So there are so many factors that are at play, and there will be times when, for example, governments have been restricted by the IMF from issuing sovereign guarantees simply because of the contingent liabilities that are associated with these guarantees. So guarantees are generally available on the continent, but there are a lot of factors that come into play, and some of these include the factors that I have discussed, the contingent liabilities and the IMF restrictions, etc. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Our next question is from Mrs. Fatima Rahman. The question is for Marc. What lessons learned for the design of flexible and resilient PPPs contracts? And how can we address and look at PPP contracts in the future, especially after the COVID-19?
Well, lessons learned are that there is now a sufficient amount of experience around the world on many types of PPP contracts to arrive to some principle, standards, and even template clauses. And nowadays, when the matter is put in a simple manner at the start of several projects by discussing with the government, then you find out that those reasonable principles that I have just outlined for some of them, for instance, hardship, which is to have a chance to recover in case of economic equilibrium, which is fully destroyed. Those principles are well understood and more. Why? Because it is the interest of both parties. It is not the interest of a public authority because they have a change of economic circumstances or because they have an issue like COVID. It's not the interest then to just terminate the contract and say, I give the contract to someone else, because the private party has done a lot of investment, he has the knowledge, he has the technology, he used to do that. So then those clauses leading to flexibility and resilience to many situations like COVID, but also many others, are becoming more and more popular. And that's why those clauses now are in the document of the UNECE, which provide for those clauses. So I advise you to look at this document, because in my experience, in many situations, we have been able, in negotiating a contract, put down on the table and to have both parties understanding the consequences. So this is something which is becoming more and more popular. And I think in the future of PPP is very much in the actual use of those clauses with a good equilibrium.
Thank you so much, Marc. The next question is from Patrick Sargent. The question is for JC. Why standardizing project agreements, guidelines for public party during the transaction phase, or models and resulting potential constraints? You're muted. It's about the benefits, I think, of a standard or limitations of a standardizing project agreements.
Yes, I see the point. it makes sense to try to, try to harmonize the way best practices are done and to recommend, as it's been done in the document we showed earlier by UNECE, to recommend the clauses. As I said, every contract is a prototype, especially in the PPP ecosystem where we operate. And so standardization is possible to a certain degree, but it needs to give room and flexibility for the parties to adapt. And I think what's even more important is to provide clauses that give flexibility in change processes. Everybody is familiar with change requests, scope variations, etc. But very seldomly have I seen contracts where the mechanism to adapt and to have that discussion that is interest-based is really properly drafted or visualized. And I think this is something so important, especially when you're talking about a very, very long-term infrastructure contract.
Yeah, thank you. And I mean, the
I may
selection.
add something.
Yes, go ahead, Marc.
I may just add a point, because just an example on this. We have done a lot of work finding out what are issues which are common to most countries, to most projects. And when it comes to PPP, you find that many of the issues are common to most countries or most projects. So then, if each time you have to redesign everything, although there has been a lot of situations which are similar, I give you just one example: tariff and service. I am a consumer. Then I am happy to pay for a public service which have certain characteristics. I need to look at my financial capacity, and my financial capacity in a particular region, particular way, is this for this particular service. But the fundamentals are always there. In order to accept to have the private sector selling to me a service, I want a service which has certain characteristics. And those certain characteristics are the same. I give you an example. For the public service, we use the same kind of definition of public service in a project in France, like a Grand Stadium project, and in a water project in Madagascar. This is very similar. All people, when you are a consumer, when you want essential public services, you have things which for you are intangible. That's why the benefit of having some form of standardization up to a certain level becomes very useful for the community.
Yeah, that's about the level that we select to standardize, and we need to make sure that we stay at the macro level with low resolution, not go into the very details. Thank you. The next question is for Primah, and the question is from Jesse Newcubby. What can we do about the challenges within Africa, especially when it comes to professional development?
I think that's a very good question, especially in light of what we are doing. And first of all, we have to start somewhere. And we agree that one of the things that we have seen with governments is that there are so many issues with capacity building. And one of the biggest challenges, like I mentioned, is the fact that there is no capacity within the governments. But as the ALSF, we have a platform called the Lsf Academy. And the Lsf Academy is an online portal that is free. It's a three-level course for PPPs and other sectors that we do. So we have an online portal that especially young PPP practitioners or people that are interested in PPPs can get upskilled. And so there's level 1, level 2, level 3, all certified. And so I think that we have to start somewhere, and that is that's one of the places that we could start in building our capacity. At the ALSF, we also have local counsel that advise on this project. And whilst international counsel will have some sort of expertise, it's the local lawyers that always know the ins and outs of the project and how it works and how licensing works and how the environmental impact assessment will work. So it has to start from upskilling, and it's an organic process. that would be. I would interest a lot of the attendees to go onto our website and just look for the lsfacademy.com. It should be a good place to start. Thank you.
Can you provide us the link of the academy on the chat box, because people are asking?
I will. Let me share.
Thank you so much. The next question is for Marc from Tibang Lisbon Roqueona. In your experience as a development practitioner, how difficult has it been to get project demand applications initiated? How amendable are governments in Africa to project initiation fees to show commitment?
Well, I'm not sure I fully understand project demand initiation. In my experience, what happens in a normal situation is that there are projects which are designed and launched for procurement, and then we have several steps according to which only a few bidders, a few companies are authorized, are permitted to participate to the tender, so it's a restricted tender. So in my experience, if that is the question, it is very, very important when you see a project of interest to be extremely serious as a private company on how to best propose at the initial stage of expression of interest, documentation, very simple, which permits you to go to the next stage, to be pre-qualified, to go to the next. It's very important, and also to find out what would be for you the cost of tendering if you are pre-qualified. Because one of the biggest problem or issue on people first public-private partnership nowadays is the cost of tendering. Typically, the cost of tendering for a people first PPP project is 5 times more than the cost of tendering for a traditional procurement or design and build and others. So the process is really, if you consider tendering, to understand that pre-qualification is just a part. The next part is extremely important and very costly, and you know in advance that if too many people are pre-qualified, it means what? It means that you have the chances to lose your part, and then if 5 are pre-qualified, there's only 1 out of 5 which will be selected. So what you have spent is not the amount for this pre-qualification, but 5 times the amount. So that issue is absolutely crucial to understand. That's why in our view, it is so important to have very simple standard bidding document, standard agreement, all that simplifying a lot the whole system.
Thank you so much. We have 10 minutes, and the next question is for JC. The question is from Mohammed Kalim Sindhu. How we can ensure that the social project is a PPP project?
Well, by making sure we speak about it, we make people aware of these people first PPP approaches, and by also insisting that there is a translation about these rather, let's say, about these rather distant, sets of rules that derive from the SDGs, but that need to translate into very specific objectives that need to be decided by the project implementation partners, by the people who prepare and by those who then implement. They need to accept these. And as I said, we need to work on forms that actually translate in points where you can measure. This is about the impact assessment of that people first public-private partnership approach. And this can be all kinds of different areas, say environmental criteria, say what is the level of employment of people with gender differences, what is the level of also social objectives that the people have together. I mean, I can remember during the days when I was working at Bombardier in the railroad industry, there was this massive Gauteng project in South Africa. And for that project, everything had to be made, you know, we decided to go completely standalone for the IT system, because we couldn't afford to take a global organization into a program like this. But this enabled to have flexibility to take in consideration, to take local people on board, to upskill these people. Those are objectives that you can achieve when you define them, and the project partners agree on these. But rather than just saying, okay, we want to do this, you actually need to measure and make sure that it's implemented properly. I hope this answers the question.
Thank you so much. It was like a very brief and informative answer to this question. I want to make sure that we still go another round for to ask questions from our speakers. The next question is for Primah. What advice to governments in the African PPP market facing financial and fiscal limitations? How to use today's crisis experience to better identify and develop projects?
Okay, I think that's a two-in-one question, and I will start with the advice that can be given to governments that are facing fiscal limitations and challenges. And I think it goes back to a point that I hinted on earlier in my discussion, which is the fact that first of all, risk can be shared, meaning that the cost, what would appear as the cost of the project, can be shared with the private sector. But most importantly, when we're talking about just limiting the cost, there's all manner of new ways to finance projects. And one such that is being tested, and I think EIB did one recently, is impact investing. I think they did one for a hospital project, I think somewhere in Asia, and that is something that is ongoing. So they're impact investors, and the government owns the resources, so it can require the private sector to find a way to cut the costs of the project through getting creative with these investors. And this would be, the financing that we can consider for example, impact investors, where you have people that are considering more than profit. So that is one of the ways. It's a big challenge. It's a big challenge, and that is why about only, I think, 5% of projects in sub-Saharan Africa are PPPs, despite the fact that so many countries have a PPP regime. It's a big challenge, but we have to start somewhere, and one of the ways to negotiate with the private sector is for them to look for more than just commercial investors, and to look for impact investors, because these investors are out there and they are looking for creative ways to do projects that will give them both profit as well as impact. So that is the first question. For the second question, Hossein, kindly read that for me again. I think it had something to do with how to use today's crisis experience to better identify and develop projects. And I think that Marc made a really good point during his presentation, that the discussion on force majeure for current projects when it comes to PPPs is not as obvious as it seems, simply because of the long-term nature. So the one thing that I would say that governments and the private sector should take from this is the keyword that has been said today, and that is the word that is flexibility. So all contracts must be flexible. They must be flexible in order to address, because there are things that will be unforeseen. Nobody could have foreseen what COVID-19 would have done to the world and to projects. So there must be flexibility built into a project and a project agreement, together with allowing for this project to continue. So despite the fact that there has been COVID-19, what is it within the project agreement? What sort of discussions are agreed to within the project agreement that can allow for continuity of the project after these months of disruption? So that is what I would say. PPP agreements must be flexible, because there will be another, God forbid, for COVID-19 or something worse than that. And so agreements need to be flexible. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Marc, would you please provide the answer to this question in 1 or 2 minutes? what is the approximate value in terms of percentage of the same contracts between value for money and value for people? And what analysis and methods are getting used in value for people?
A question for me? Okay. Well, value for money comes from 1994 LATAM report in the UK. And the LATAM report was a report which was only considering how to best finance the public buildings that the UK are difficult to finance due to the Maastricht 3% deficit limit of Europe. So then all value for money started from there. So then that had consequences on many things. It was essentially something which were linked to financing an existing or new project for a building. Fine, that's project finance. And project finance is not new because it's coming from many other places in a larger project, in hydro and other petrol around the world. Now, what we are seeing here is that we want to have other indicators, which of course will also always use value for money. And essentially value for money compare whether PPP can be better to start with than other delivery options which are at the disposal. And I think it's very important in this respect to remember that people first is not at all specific to PPP. People first is a basket of criteria which have to be used for any public infrastructure project. When I have to make a plant, when I have to make a road, when I have to make a railway, any country has to look, is that in the best interest of my people? What are the externalities, etc.? So people first is absolutely not special to PPP, and that is extremely important to understand. And then from there, we understand that PPP is just something which sometimes can be done because it is better than other form. And that is where come value for money. So value for money is, and value for people is more or less the same, in my view, to all projects. Then in PPP, you have several additional indicators to put in order to find out whether it is the best. One of them is the question of the budgetary consequences. If the project you are developing has an impact on public debt for 10 to 20, 10, 20 or 30 years, then this is something to consider, whether this should be in PPP, and look at the alternative. Many projects, I give you a very good example, is in terms of a solar power project. And in very few situations, if you do use all the indicators on best people first, whether it is PPP or another approach, you find out that the other approach is better than PPP. Same for several PPP nowadays called social PPP. You find out that many situations, instead of doing PPP, it's best value for people to do the same project, not in PPP. So at the end of the day, the value for people for PPP means that you have to add several criteria to the one already used for value for people, in my view, for any infrastructure project.
Thank you so much. Yes, it's very important not to be biased to PPPs, and this is what many countries in developing basically environment and economies are doing. So because they don't have access to money, they need to make sure that they have a balanced approach. I would like to take another question very quickly for JC by our friend Dr. Irfan. I think one of the common concerns in privately financed PPP project is market or demand risk, particularly aimed at uncertainty over long-term tenure. Said that, do you think that it is important to embed this in the contract in order to attract private investors to step in, or it's better to be case by case?
I didn't understand acoustically the second part of the question. Is it better to invest in?
Do you think it is important to embed this in the contract in order to attract private investors to step in, or it is better to be case by case?
Well, I assume that it's in the interest of any investor to know what the investor gets and what the vision is of of the government that wants to have an infrastructure done, at least, I mean, that's a reasonable approach to understand what are the metrics behind that. And I think it's very important also to make that, to objectify that from the beginning, because if the public tender is not clear and transparent with regard to the measuring points, and you don't have a comparability there, then it's hard for me to understand how that would be adjudicated.
Do you want to add anything?
No, I think it's perfect and well said.
Thank you. Primah, do you want to add any other points at the end?
No, thank you. No, I'm good.
Okay, so thank you, the speakers. By that, we are at the end of our presentation because we want to, our webinar, in fact, we want to stick into the time. So can we have the next slide to basically introduce WAPP? I'm not sure if you are already the WAPP member, thank you for being involved in this home for PPP professionals. But if not, and if you wish to get involved, or you can just email us at contact@wapp.org. WAPP is a very nice and friendly home for PPP professionals and units. It has a very flexible and open environment for you to network with others, to link with PPP units, to use these free webinars, share knowledge, look for job opportunities, and also you can benefit from discounts that are, for example, for the CP3P program. So make sure that you are the member of WAPP. And by that, I think we can adjourn the webinar if our speakers are happy to do that. Yes. Okay, so thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.